thank you for inviting me for this webinar. Although I have to say that I wasn't too keen on the webinars, but then I thought this topic really fits with what I discussed in my book. And actually, checking it yesterday, there is even the word avatar in it. So that's why I thought it might be an interesting opportunity to discuss it with the audience around the world. And I just want to say, first of all, because I watched the previous webinar of the preview with Caroline, which was very interesting, but I want to say this one, on my presentation at least, will be very different, because what I'm going to talk about is mainly a theoretical proposition, one of the many of several that I introduced in the book, Developmental Coaching, Working with the Self. And this proposition has some support in the book, of course, with the knowledge around the theories, the research, but I wouldn't have much time in this presentation to talk about the support for this proposition. But I thought it would be interesting simply to discuss it, but if you want to look further, you can find the support for these ideas in the book. Okay, so I will let me show what we are going to discuss. What I plan for us is to look at two angles on the multiplicity of self, and then we will consider how avatars and the whole idea of virtual environment can bring different dimension to the exploration of the self. And then, with the help of the staff of Prevail, you will learn how to bring these ideas into your own practice through coaching, if you are interested in coaching. This is the plan. And let's start with the self. And I think that the self is the huge challenge in principle. And we need to start, and we'll have a little voting on the idea how well do we know ourselves, which may actually sounds like a strange question, because everyone probably thinks that they do know ourselves, yourself. But I'm just going to say that in order to answer it properly, we really need to see what the self is anyway, and my argument will be that it is a mystery. Okay. But before we will go into that, let's do the poll. Okay. So the questions are, who can better predict your behavior, you or people who were able to observe you in different situations? And you can see the options for you to vote.
Okay, so you can see the quick poll now on your screen, so vote when you're ready.
So the results are coming.
Thanks, Michal.
So let's another 3 seconds for voting.
It's a difficult question. It might not be easy to answer straight away.
Okay. So I'm going to share the results with you now. So most of the group here answered, I'm not sure, but maybe equally.
Right, okay. Okay, that sounds sort of quite reasonable in my view. Why? Because if you would mainly answer the questions because A, I know yourself better, you would have very strong opponents to this view. And I will show you a quote from one of them, and that was Daniel Danin, who wrote the book Strangers to Ourselves, but this is the quote from Guy Claxton, who actually argued that we have no privileged access to ourselves, and supervisors, teachers, trainers know their students better than they know themselves. People are misguided about what they want, and the argument is built that we are built to predict other people's behavior from the minute signs, but find it difficult to predict our own behavior. And they give a lot of examples, very interesting examples, to demonstrate that predicting behavior is much better from those who actually observe us in action. And that seems to be a puzzle, because from inside it feels that we can predict it better. But I just want to read you one quote. It's in a funny way describes how often we are misled about that. And it is from also Guy Clarkson's book, because he writes very good sense of humor about that. He said, I meant to keep my cool, but I just couldn't. I'm supposed not to eat pork, but I forgot. I decided on an early night, but somehow here we are in the Piccadilly Circus at 4 a.m. with silly hats and a bottle of wine. And you may disagree, maybe you are very sort of knowledgeable yourself and can predict your behavior, but a lot of data shows that it's not easy. Okay, and that is connected, I think, the explanation for that, with an idea that the self is a puzzle. Because the common sense usually suggests that we are like the first picture, like some operator in the brain that actually can lead our behavior, and we are in a very close touch with that operator. But lots of science, and particularly from neuroscience, actually now shows that the picture is like a second one, that we have lots of mini selves operating at the same time, and mostly unconsciously when we are engaged in the world. And I don't want to put it on the screen, but I will read you the quote from one of the well-known neuroscientists, Gazaniga, who actually said that, I think the notion of linear, unified conscious experience is dead wrong. In contrast, I argue that the human brain has a modular type of organization. By modularity, I mean that the brain is organized into relatively independent functioning units that work in parallel. The mind is not an indivisible whole operating in a single way to solve all the problems. Rather, there are many specifics and identifiably different units of the mind dealing with all information they are exposed to. And these modular activities frequently operate apart from our conscious verbal selves. So this is the challenging picture, but in some way it's a useful picture. And what it implies that the mind is extended and multiple. Extended because when we are engaged with something in the world, it's the situation itself also demands something from us. We have an input from the situation, and then one particular combinations of the links between different areas of brain becomes activated or inhibits other area when organism is involved in the act. So then we can say that rather than one unified cell, there are many modules, independent functioning units of many cells, and each of them allows the organism interactive engagement with certain tasks. So that is already the idea of multiplicity in relation to how we act in the world. And then we are talking about this multiplicity of cells. I just want to say a little bit how these mini cells could look like, and quoting some interesting people in relation to them. They said many cells are dynamic, functional, and not limited by the skin of the organisms. So because we are involved with different people in different situations. And how Kurzban, for example, says that different modules comes online and go offline at different times, having more or less influence depending on the situation. And Clarkson also gives a sort of interesting visual analogy to that. He said that every new situation gives a shake to the top of my personality. And for that reason, it brings us to the quite challenging idea that there are no one unified authentic self, only those different mini cells that are involved in constant interplay. I hope that makes sense, but I just want to show that this is how we are actually engaged in the world. So our engagement in the world is supported by this mini self that help us to to act. Okay. And some consequences of it, and I just want to use more kind of humorous one, because Kurzban wrote a lovely book which is called Why Everyone Else, if you can see it, is hypocrite. And why? Because he said consistency is not a default. It takes careful engineering to keep system consistent. In some cases, the human mind is engineered in this way, but in many cases it is not. And if consistency doesn't improve the functioning of the system overall, there are no particular reason to expect it. And for that reason, he said the modular design of the human mind guarantees hypocrisy. Okay.
We've got a comment here from Anne Owen, who says, makes sense in relation to when we're in different roles, but I think you're talking about more than that. And I mean, we talked about this earlier about Moreno's thinking about roles as well.
Yes, and I agree, because of the roles they usually connect us with situation. Yep. And yes, and this is correct, because there is something more than that, and we will move into it in a minute. But I just, before, if people feel slightly uneasy about this explanation and justification of hypocrisy, I want to show a little positive way of looking at multiplicity. And that comes from Walt Whitman, who actually says, do I contradict myself? Very well. Then I contradict myself. I'm large, I contain multitude. So can you see the difference here? He's also suggesting, that's lovely, that's wonderful. It's okay to know that we act like mini cells rather than one authentic cell. But, and that's where it becomes much more difficult, because we are not just only acting organisms, like animals. We also have speech, we also can talk, we also can make meaning, we can self-reflect, and for that reason we create different stories about ourselves. And this creates sort of a different dimension. And do you remember I said from the very beginning we will look at two angles. So the one angle is how we act. This angle is how we present ourselves. And for that reason, we create different stories. And you probably noticed in different situations, we describe ourselves in a different way. And you probably notice how your story changed throughout life, how they change from one person to another when you are discussing it with them. And so it is, we are story-making creatures, we can say. And but these stories, they are influenced not only what we decide to tell ourselves, it also always was influenced by other people who influenced us. And that's why Gallagher and Zahavi, they said that the beginning of my story has always already been made for me by others, and the way the story unfolds is only a part determined by my own choices and decisions. And I want to show you, again, lovely cartoons that demonstrate for me how we are creating this story on the basis of what other people think about us. You can see now Lucy and Snoopy. Lucy says, you know, there are times when you really bag me. But then he said, but I must admit there are also times when I feel like giving you a hug. And then she gives him a hug, and then that's what the conclusion that Snoopy makes. That's the way I am, buggable and huggable. And that's what comes from parents, that's come from society, that's how we create these different stories ourselves. And in this case, and that's why I wanted to show that particular cartoon, because in this case, it's a contradictory information. So sometimes our stories contradict each other. Okay. And then we need to ask the question how true the story is. And of course, this is not a work of historian, as Haidt says, Jonathan Haidt, and you probably have saw his lovely book, which called The Happiness Hypothesis, when he makes very good case for that. He said, our conscious mind does not have access to the real causes of behavior. It is more like a work of historical fiction that makes plenty of references to real events and connects them by dramatization interpretations that might or might not be true to the spirit of what happens. Okay? So what he is actually saying, if we return back to the mini cells, So the mini selves are quite often unconscious. So that's why we have difficulties predicting our behavior sometimes, because they are features of the organism. But the story we create ourselves it's a creation of our conscious mind very often. And for that reason, Kurzban also argues, you are a Machiavellian spin doctor. Machiavellian, I can pronounce it wrong. And as such, only a small part of the sum total of what is going on in your head. And now we can come more closer to the multiplicity of selves and avatars. Because what it says, the ideas of avatars, that it makes it very explicit that avatars are stories, and the creation of the stories. By creating avatar, you create this story, and it is a lovely creative act. It's like writing a fiction, and sometimes we actually put too much emphasis on their real existence, but if it is accepted by being treated as a fiction, avatars may highlight the transient nature of self-story and maybe highlight the unnecessary attachment to them. And for that reason, you can also just relieve some sort of tensions that might exist for the person of who I really am, and is it possible to describe and be yourself. And also you can use it for the positive purpose of practicing, training, experimenting, because you can actually choose to enact various roles from real life by using avatars, and that can enhance the actual mini selves that serve these roles. Is it okay so far?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So there's I've noticed the word authentic leadership appearing in a lot of coaching and learning and development, and I guess associated with that would be some people say that if the manager or the leader is constantly acting in different ways, we lose some sense of trust and connection. How much do we believe them? So what happens to the authentic leader?
Right. The whole idea of authenticity is a very, of course, relevant question to ask, but it's the most confusing one if we see the nature of self in this way, okay? Because traditional way of seeing authenticity is like being true to yourself, right? That's how people normally understand authenticity. But if we actually see the self as a combination of mini selves, and there is stories that we tell, then this meaning of being true to what? Okay, it becomes very complex. Okay, so that's why I'm just saying that it's not a very useful concept in principle, authenticity. But when people talk about authentic leadership, they mean something else. So they usually, and they don't explain it, they just simply attribute to the authentic leaders all positive qualities. So they don't explain what the authenticity is about. Okay? Everyone attach different meaning to the authenticity of leaders. That's how I see it.
Right. Thank you.
But in the can I just make some sort of little deviation from it? Because I think that often people talking about authenticity called existentialists who brought this idea of this concept, talking about bad faith, for example, as for example. But if you carefully read actually what existentialists typically mean about authenticity, it's a very different thing, because they don't talk about being true to ourselves, because for Sartre, for example, there is no self also, there is kind of the self is empty. So what they mean by authenticity is a radical openness to the world. It's more or less authenticity of being true to the situation when you see the reality and then you engage with that openly and explicitly, and knowing that you are engaging fully with that. That's what they mean by authenticity, and I think it's a beautiful concept, and we underestimate it very much.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so then I just want to summarize so far what I said, and then it may be some questions after that. So what I'm just trying to say that the self that engages with the world is multiple. The story we create about ourselves can also be multiple, as much as we try to create some sort of synthesis. It is important to say that to change the story is easier than to change a mini-self, because the mini-self is behavior, and sometimes it's in a lovely way can talk about ourselves, but it doesn't mean that we are transformed, and that is another issue with transformation very often. And I want just to say that we as coaches or counselors, we often don't deal with the mini-selves. We don't deal with the selves that actually act. We often deal with the stories of ourselves. But it's still useful. It's useful to discuss it, because sometimes these stories, they have a hold on the way we act, and unraveling these stories, it's very helpful. And plus, multiplicity of self is useful because it allows better adjustment to different roles, to different circumstances, to changes that we have in the values and culture. Is it okay so far, everyone?
Just keep your comments coming, please, and any questions, put those in the Q&A.
Okay, and the final things I want to say about that is how it's relevant to coaching, to counseling, or any personal development work. And there are several ways of dealing with multiplicity of self in coaching, for example. First of all, it's useful to consider and accept the idea of multiplicity. And there are very interesting studies saying that we are even healthier if we see that multiplicity more openly. There's one very interesting experiment in the States when they asked students to choose as many characteristics from the list of different personality features. They asked them to choose how many they can apply to themselves. And interestingly enough, as a result of it, what shows that those people who have chosen much more of those characteristics were apparently were dealing with stress much better, they had less infections, they were less depressed than others. So it's actually the fact of accepting is already useful. Then you may be working, and it could be useful to work trying to match the self-story with the real mini-self. And what I mean by that, because sometimes there is the real conflict between the story you tell. So, for example, I can tell you that I'm a very reliable person, but then always late when we start. So this is a real mismatch between mini-self and the story. And although maybe as a coach you can't pick this up directly, but it's possible to. And it's not that we need to sort of challenge clients all the time, because some of them may not need to, but it could be useful as well. And we also, the idea of stories and mini-selves and this multiplicity can say that we are capable of learning even from the fake experience. And that is where the also avatars come in the picture, because if you actually identify yourself in the avatar, in the exercise or in communication, then you will see in that and make avatar work or act or say something or do something. It means that, and that's how the brain works, it still creates the learning opportunity. So it works like as if it's in real circumstances.
Okay. A couple of questions here coming up. Mm-hmm. Do you mean that mini-self is how we actually behave?
Yes. Yes, how we engage with the world, yes.
Thanks, Anne. Another one here. Presumably Myers-Briggs and similar profiling techniques can get quite complicated with multiple selves.
Oh, that's a lovely question. I want actually to say something about that.
Well done, Andrew.
Because if you can see, this conceptualization of self creates huge problems for psychometrics instrument. Because, and I can talk, give more, I don't know how much time I have. Is it still okay?
we're okay until
a couple of
another couple of minutes.
I nearly finished anyway. Because with the psychometric instrument, especially with the traits type of instrument, MBTI that you mentioned, it's not the traits, it's a type of instrument. So it's sort of reasonable to some extent, okay, because there is no strong statement there. But in traits instrument, you actually don't know what you measure, okay, strictly speaking. From which self did you feel in that questionnaire? Okay, that's the question is. And then actually even the people who designed like Big Five or Big Six, they find it quite disturbing to realize that when people are asked to fill the questionnaires from particular role, which is what we are calling the mini self, okay, then the scores is changing, and it's quite disturbing. Okay? But it's actually support this idea 100%. But I don't want to be very negative about use of psychometric instruments. I think coaches can use psychometric instruments, but use it in a different way. So, for example, they can ask a more interesting question, just to say, who do you think was behind this particular answers when you fill this questionnaire? Who was missing in that picture? Or what does it say about you and your relationship between these different selves? So you more or less kind of use it to highlight the paradoxes that we just discussed.
Now the concepts of C.W. Graves are based on the multiplicity.
Do you mean Claire Graves?
I don't know, I just got to see this is from Klaus. So maybe we get a bit more on that. Klaus,
yes, I know about Claire Graves, and but as far as I know, he kind of connected to the levels of the stages of development of the self, and I didn't touch on this concept in this presentation, but it might be useful to discuss it, but probably too big a topic.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions. Are you coming from psychosynthesis perspective with the notion of subpersonalities?
No, actually, I like the whole idea of psychosynthesis, and I like the idea of subpersonalities, especially as presented by John Rowan. But I think what is different, because I'm not, if you notice that I'm not suggesting anything dramatically new, because the modularity of mind discussed in neuroscience, the subpersonality discussed in different areas of psychology. What I'm suggesting that it's very often confused and mixed up. So people accept subpersonality as expression of real mini-selves. And that's, I disagree with John Rowan, for example, in relation to subpersonalities, because he describes them as if they are really there. But I just think the separation of the story between and the modules of actually how we engage with the world is important, because this recommendation they are just suggesting, it implies that that separation is meaningful.
Another question here, are our mini-selves equal, or it may happen that one of them is predominant or more frequently displayed?
I see mini-selves as kind of varied, because sometimes the mini-selves are tiny, like you reach the glass of water when you're thirsty, or huge mini-selves that are connected to, let's say, how we behave with a particular type of people, or driving a car, or giving a presentation. It depends kind of how frequently you use your roles. That's the one, the mini-self, that mini-self will be showing that often. But when we create stories of ourselves, we tend to create them as a kind of overarching, very big ones. And that's what I'm saying is quite often creates a confusion.
Keep the questions coming, thank you.
Okay, good questions. But actually, I wanted just to say only one small thing about the idea of the synthesis. Because if you can see from this idea, there is no need to have many kind of to see many cells, actual mini cells, as something like like one thing, okay? Because it's not that self, it's just a network of different mini selves that allows us to act. So for that reason, there is no synthesis to some extent, okay? And actually, and that's why it's useful to see it as separate. But when we think about it, we have a natural tendency to create some consistency, to create some bigger picture of who I am, okay? And I'm saying that sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. Because, and it depends who you are working with. Because when people are at the stage of development, when they are very much kind of lack confidence, and they tend to have huge generalization about themselves, like I'm a complete failure, I'm useless. Okay? So for them, this synthesis, if you can see, is not useful at all. So for them, it's better to separate it and to say, no, that's let's look at that particular kind of expression. Let's say something like coaches say, something about what you can do well, all these things. So for them, I would say synthesis is not useful. But for people who are already kind of became over this side of themselves, they already kind of accepted who they generally in principle are. For them, synthesis could be interesting and useful. So, and I would say, but then they create another set of paradoxes that I don't have time now to discuss.
Get some questions.
Yes, and that's probably, yes, and that's only the references.
One question from Loud. How do the mini cells collaborate?
The actual mini cells collaborate by the fact of us being a human being in one organism. It's in one brain. That's how it's collaborate. But you can, collaboration, it's an interesting word because for me it's like they are working in parallel, but it's not someone who is kind of strongly coordinated. It's whatever task is right now become more important and it goes on the top of the pile and you are acting it. Or sometimes people are capable of doing things in parallel. So that's why it's a coordination just happens rather than you create it.
And Mikhail, we can take live questions now. I think, Mikhail, if you can manage this, so you can put your hand up and we've got about 3 or 4 minutes to take some more questions from the floor.
Yeah, if you want to ask the live questions, so please raise the hand. There is a button on the top left as well.
One just come through from Caroline. Oh, good morning, Caroline. Who or what mediates the collaboration between the mini cells?
Who coordinates?
Who or what mediates the collaboration between the mini cells?
Caroline, could you say what you mean by mediate? Sorry, question to question.
We've got answer live. We'll just give this another couple.
Oh, you can hear me. Oh, that's fine.
We can hear you.
I was just wondering, I mean, I was intrigued by this idea of a potential collaboration between the mini cells. And I was just wondering so the question was what was or who is the mediator between the multiple selves? So is there another self that kind of mediates between, you know, my competitive self or my I don't know, kind self, for example? That was my question.
No, in terms of action, Caroline, I don't think we have any coordinators, because when your competitive self kind of comes into the picture, it acts. You can, after that, your other self that might actually feel that doesn't like competition. After that, it's oh, I really don't like that I was competitive and then. But what I'm saying, there is no coordination in real action. But it's when you create a story and you try to sort of make sense of all of this, then it is your, I call it narrator, who actually tried to create a coherent story between the different selves.
Okay, thank you very much for all your questions, and Tatiana, thank you very much indeed. That was thought-provoking, I think, as I expected this subject to be, and I think what's certainly something that's resonating for me is the acceptance of those stories and those roles. That was probably a role in me that was probably quite critical that I might have several. But actually, I like the idea of them, of accepting them. I feel a bit more playful, actually.
Yes, exactly. And that is one of the sort of way, advanced developmental way of dealing with them.
Okay, shall we move on? So we'll move on to the live.